Okay guys, welcome back to the video, and today I got something special for you. I'm going to show you how I clean out my Saturn II. I'm going to be throwing in some footage of me cleaning it out and explaining my process in which how I clean it out. Now let's get into it. Okay, when you are 3D printing, you want to make sure that you have the proper PPE, which is personal protection equipment. You want to make sure you have your gloves, a smock to keep resin from getting off your clothes. I'm going to show you what I wear when I started my 3D resin process.
This is what I wear when I do my resin printing, when I first started out resin printing. I have my protective gas mask because I was scared of ventilation fumes, protective gloves, any kind of silicone gloves, rolled up, or got some nice there, and then a smock to keep the resin from getting on your clothes.
When I first started out, that's how I looked. After a while, I got more comfortable with resin printing and I started downgrading. As you can see, or kind of hear, there's kind of an echo, but I do post cut and stuff like that. I do take the echo away, but I am out in the garage. This is well ventilated and I don't have to worry about fumes. If you're in a house and you don't have much, you probably should invest into a mask or some kind of protective face covering that's going to not let you inhale that many fumes or vapors. You want some protective gloves? Definitely want these. These are the main things that you are going to need because these are what's going to keep the resin from getting on your hands. You cannot touch resin. It is very toxic and it can cause many problems. I have discovered I'm not that allergic to resin, but resin builds up a tolerance over time and then eventually you do become allergic. So you have to be protective and reduce as much exposure to resin as physically possible. And I wear a smock sometimes just for painting in general. You can get these for cheap or you can find a nice cloth one somewhere. Search around. You may find one that's really nice for you. You can use a cooking apron, anything works to keep resin from getting on your clothes. But I always roll up my sleeves and I use gloves. As you can see in the video, when I am working and handling this stuff, I am using gloves. Two more things you're going to need. You're going to need isopropyl alcohol and paper towels. You're going to need lots of paper towels. When you are cleaning out your tank, you're going to need lots of paper towels. This is what soaks up all that resin. And you need a special place to put all that resin in a trash can, and then you need to dispose of it properly. Isopropyl alcohol desaturates the resin. You want to clean, this is what you use to clean your resin models, and this is what you use to clean up that excess resin to make sure that everything, your surfaces are nice and clean and ready to use again. These are what basically hospitals use to clean after their patients are done. This is what hospitals use. Make sure you're using isopropyl alcohol. Try to get a hold of a 91 or the best percentage alcohol you can get. Okay, with the process of cleaning my Saturn II out, I go through and I take the tank out off the 3D printer. And as I do that, I pour it into a filtered cup back into the resin. I pour the resin back into a filtered cup to strain all the particles and bits out of the resin that has gotten into there on the repeated failed attempts at 3D printing. I don't have footage of me actually tank cleaning, but when you go through and you start your first process in tank cleaning your resin printer, there's a tool, you go into your settings and you go to tank clean. Usually you can set it to a timer on it. It's usually preset to 15 seconds. I usually do it for 20 seconds to make sure I get a good thick resin film to pull up when the support's in there. But I take a support, I put it into the resin, and I push down to make sure it's against the FEP sheet, to make sure that there's no resin that actually cures between the FEP sheet and that. There's different ways you can do it. Sometimes you could probably leave it a little to where the resin's at the bottom of it, and it makes a thicker adhere to the supports. And when you go to pull it up, you pull it up as one. In this bucket, you can see in the bucket you can see bits and pieces of a FEP sheet, like the printout. You can see the little part, or the screen shaped resin print from where I've cleaned the FEP sheet a couple times for misprints and stuff like that. I use that to store uncured resin supports in there to use in the 3D printing process, so I can get in there and use that tool, the tank cleaning tool, to actually pull up those sheets without actually having to empty the resin reservoir, the FEP sheet and all that back into the bottle, pull the screen off, and then re-add the resin in. But when I am cleaning it, I take the tank out, I unscrew the little knobs that keep the tank situated in and from moving. Sometimes I forget to put those back in after cleaning the tank, and it causes misprints. And then I go back through and I was like, oh, well, the tank wasn't secured down. So that causes misprints. So you have to be meticulous when you are 3D printing to make sure that you put everything back the way you had it before you start printing again. Because if you don't do it the right way, say you don't screw the knob at the top of the leveling plate correctly, it causes shakiness and instability, and it causes misprints. There's a lot that goes into misprints. Sometimes prints just misprint in general when you do everything correctly. So make sure you're doing everything correctly and putting everything back the way it needs to be when you are 3D printing. But with all that, after I take that, and it is a slow process when draining that resin back into the bottle. It's a slow, meticulous process, especially when you got big chunks of resin cures coming out of the tank. And all those little big chunks are most likely what's causing misprints as well. There's so much that goes into misprinting, and as you can see in my shorts, I am misprinting a lot when it comes to unsupported, untested STL files, and you have to make your own supports or you have the slicer do it. After it drains back into the bottle, I take the cup, I put it in a spacing. You want a nice open space, as big as you can provide when you are putting your stuff around, because when you move resin to a certain area, it gets everywhere. There is no stopping resin from getting everywhere. But after I'm done draining the tank draining the resin back from the reservoir to the bottle, I go and I spray the FEP sheet and all that down with some isopropyl alcohol and let that seep and get underneath that FEP sheet to get all that resin that seeps underneath that FEP sheet and gets stuck inside the grooves of the tank. I also, as you can see, am cleaning off the 3D prints that are messed up or that didn't mess up, and putting them in a safe, separated area. I have myself a nice little cookie sheet tray that I use to actually scrape my prints off onto. I was using that rubber mat that you see underneath, but I got a metal tray because it helps with actually when I slip, because when you're using a lot of force to pry the resin models off the build plate, sometimes it slips. And I was cutting into that mat, and I decided that I would use a cookie sheet to give it more. It just works better. It just works better to have the cookie sheet in the metal and use it to pry the sheets off and make it easier to get the models off. I use that, and it's got a little lip that catches all that resin and make sure that it doesn't spill over. So I have 2 layers of protection before any resin kind of rolls off the shelf. So you want to have a designated area that you put your completed models off, and that you use the pry them off the build plate and make sure that you can clean it very well. And with the cookie sheet is much easier to clean than it is that silicone mat. So that's why I'm using the cookie sheet, because the resin just kind of collects all that alcohol, kind of turns more liquidy, and then I can wipe it up with paper towels and it soaks into the resin sheet. But after I do that, I clean and I just go through. I have a little bottle with the alcohol in it, and I go through and spray everything that has been exposed to liquid resin, so I'm not touching anything or I accidentally don't get it all on my hands before leaving. I clean that FEP sheet. I make sure everything is all nice and clean and tidy. I try to clean as much resin as physically possible, and it helps. After I've cleaned and sanitized everything, I go through and I reattach the build plate for my leveling process. I follow the instructions. When you get a 3D printer, it will come with instructions on how to level your 3D printer. Each 3D printer is going to be different on how it levels and does things. There's some that auto level and it just works. Mine's not an auto level, so what I have to do is I have to use this big Allen key, loosen them up, lower the build plate to the surface, let it go, and then tighten it up, and then put a piece of paper or something that acts like the FEP sheet to create a little distance between the screen and the build plate, to create a little inch so that it doesn't crush the FEP sheet or it's not pressing up against it. After leveling, I set it to 0, and then I reinstall reinstall the tank. Before I reinstall the tank, I go through with a little Rain-X. I find using Rain-X helps a lot with the resin, making sure it doesn't actually stick to the FEP sheet or inside the tank, because it just helps all that roll off and all that. That's my personal preference. It was a little trick I picked up, somebody used, and I've liked it ever since. I used it when I had my Anycubic 3D printer, and it helped with my prints. I was having misprints after misprints, and then I used the Rain-X, and it all of a sudden started working, so I've been using it since. I feel like the Rain-X helps, especially when you're cleaning, because it helps all that resin just kind of roll off that FEP sheet and doesn't actually stay or stick to it. And you have to sit there and hold it for a while. It just kind of just rolls into the bottle or the funnel. After doing all that, after leveling the 3D printer, I go back through and I reinstall everything. I re-add the resin back to the tank, and then I continue on printing as normal. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate you guys for staying to the end and watching me on how I clean my Saturn 3 watching and how I clean my Saturn 2 and get 3D resin out, filter everything, and then re-level it. I know it's not a comprehensive guide, and I know there's more people that do a lot better job than I do, but I figured I'd show you guys how I do it, and hopefully you guys can feel comfortable enough to start 3D printing yourself. You need a good area, but you don't need that big of an area. It's going to be very frustrating to have a small area, but it is possible. But I do recommend having a ventilated area. If you don't have a ventilated area, please print safely, because these fumes are toxic and they can damage your health. When you are 3D printing, make sure you take safety very, very seriously. Please take safety very seriously when 3D printing. But as I said, if you did tune into the end of this video, please like and subscribe. It helps a ton. And that's it for the video. And remember to wash those dirty sprues.